Okay, Sealander episode number 2. We have the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. And Tristan, the 13-year-old, is going to tell us a little bit about this book or his impressions.
Well, compared to Why Gold, Why Now, it was a bit harder to read because his writing is more in depth. It's an old Englishman, so he talks a lot about virtue, a lot of things it's hard to understand, but I got a lot of interesting things from this book. He didn't mention his birth when he was born, but he did mention it was in New England and that he went to a couple schools, but he was constantly pulled back, so he was mainly self-taught. He was the youngest son and the third youngest child of 17 kids. His father married twice. And he loved to read when he was around 15, read a lot of books, was very involved with them. He read one by an old author, and this author must have been a vegan because he wrote a lot about it in this book. So Franklin decided to become a vegan at the age of 15 or 16, which he didn't break this until a lot later on. And so he followed this a lot. And he eventually went to help his brother at 17. His brother owned a printing house. And his brother was in charge there, had a couple employees. His brother, though, at one point wrote something that the public didn't like, so he had to go to prison for a little bit. And his brother was a little cross with Franklin after coming back. Eventually, Franklin decided to go to Pennsylvania, and he there was employed by a Jewish printer who also owned a printing house. There's only a couple there, wasn't a very professional, and they worked certain days but never on the Sabbath. And he did a lot of things during this time. He also taught some young gentlemen who didn't know how to swim, and one day he taught them how to swim. He had a couple friends, but a lot of them, he broke relationships with them because of certain situations. One was a young lad called Collins. Their relationship ended after Collins got drunk, and while on a boat with Franklin and a couple other young men, Collins refused to row, so Franklin pitched him over the side and wouldn't let him in the boat until he promised to row. So after that, Collins left, never paid off his debt that he owed Franklin for some minor thing, and Franklin never saw him again. The other friend was a young poet he liked poetry, and they were friends for a little longer, but Franklin had a little incident with the man's wife, so I guess he was courting her or getting a little too nice with her, so
This was in the book somewhere?
Yep. His name was Ralph, and Ralph eventually left and went to England, wanted to become a poet there, but no one much liked his work, so I think he became a teacher instead, though he liked poetry. And eventually he met the governor of Pennsylvania, who promised Franklin he would give him a printing house and help him operate it, but his father, Ben Franklin's father, didn't exactly like this and thought he was a little too young to be given so much money, so they never did it. The governor actually just didn't do it at all. So that was that. And while working with some other employees, he noticed how a lot of them drank at least a pint of beer a day or more, and they ate lots of stuff, while he found that he liked oatmeal with some pepper and stuff, and he was quite healthy. He started a club, which Ralph was still with him, I think, at this time, and they compared their books, and at one point Ben Franklin suggested they all bring their books together so that they could make a sort of library where they could read each other's books, but this didn't work out very well, so they soon dismissed it, and each taking their own volumes back to their houses. And let's see. He soon became part of an assembly, a political assembly, helping with matters of, the Pennsylvanian government was involved with that and had a wife, lost a son who was 4 years old to smallpox, and so he tried to help out with stuff. And when he went to he relates part of things that he didn't like in London. He said London, their lamps were not so good. They were smoky, and so a couple hours after they lit them, the London would look very bleak and dark, and the lamps would be smoky. And there was a very simple fix that Ben Franklin soon provided for America, but London was stuck in their ways.
What
And
was the fix?
the fix, I think it was adding vents to the bottom of the lamp to let more airflow instead of smudging it. And then he also related how he invented a way to make a stove work better, as somehow adding more vents to the side or the top, so it worked better, and he had someone design it for him, and so that worked out really well. And he also had a couple other things. He was a man who enjoyed virtue. He wasn't a churchgoer, didn't really like going to church, only attended a couple sermons. But he was very set on virtues, believed in God, and he had a couple: temperance, silence, resolution, order, cleanness, so on and so forth. He said one of the hardest ones was order, keeping order in his things, and another one was silence, being not putting in what you think, not, more saying it seems to me like this instead of saying, well, I think it's like this. He tried to not be more of a boaster, tried not to get into arguments with people. And though this book was hard to read, I found a couple amusing parts in here. One of them being an account where he was trying to house some Indians instead of letting them go roaming around, and he wanted to house them.
Native Americans?
Yep, Native Americans, and they wanted to have rum immediately. They demanded rum, but he refused and said he'd only give it if they cooperated. So they cooperated, and he gave them rum, and so they were housed by the evening. But all the women and men immediately got drunk, and in the middle of the night came pounding on his door and demanded rum, and he just ignored them. So, and then next morning they came back to apologize, knowing they'd behaved wrongly, and they blamed it all on the rum. But then they tried to excuse the rum by saying, the Great Spirit made all things, and those for a certain purpose, and that certain purpose should be put to use. Now when he made rum, he said, let this be for the Indians to get drunk with, and it must be so.
This is in the book?
This is in the book. He wrote it that way.
Okay.
I find it amusing. It's silly, blaming rum and then trying to excuse the rum.
And what was the reason it was hard to read? Just because it was old school?
Basically old school, although I found out that it was more of a book where you start reading and you can't just instantly be hooked.
It's not entertaining?
Well, it was entertaining, but when you started reading, you couldn't just be hooked instantly. I had to read some, and once I started reading about 3 or 4 pages, that's when it started getting in depth, and it was more of like getting into a rhythm of reading. And then it became easier as I went on. So he also helped construct some forts. He was asked to do this, and he led some men out, and they constructed these forts. And he said that the men actually were happier when they worked. On the days that they couldn't work, when it was rainy, they were grumbly and grouchy. But on the days when the sun was shining and when they could help construct the forts, they were all happy and merry and gay. Gay as in joyful. So eventually he got tired, and so he returned home. And he had one incident that he was going to England, and just the person who was keeping lookout, they accidentally fell asleep during their duty, and so they almost crashed into the cliffside, except one man noticed the lighthouse in time, so they were able to get her.
They were in a boat?
Yep, they were in a boat. And so he said in the book that if he ever returned to America, I believe he wrote this before the Revolutionary War, he said if he ever returned, he would greatly encourage making white lighthouses because it saved him that night. See, and he also had an encounter with General Braddock.
Who's that?
Braddock was a English general who came over to the U.S. so he could help fight the French and Indians. So he came over and they had a lack of horses and wagons. So Ben Franklin helped to provide these, had farmers give them so they could borrow it. And once they were sent off with a good amount of supplies, a bit later, a doctor and another, I think a professor, came and asked if he could help them raise money to construct a firework that they would set off when they learned that General Braddock had captured a fort. I can't pronounce it. It was Dusq, something I can't pronounce.
Mm-hmm.
So he declined this and said he didn't want to, and they were surprised and said, "What, you don't think we will take the fort?" And he said that he didn't think so, and he gave his point, saying that he thought they'd be ambushed in this spot where the men would have to spread out in a very long line. And eventually they were ambushed, but not in that spot, and it was in believe a hilly country where British soldiers weren't used to fighting, and they were just picked off by the French and the Indians, and so they all died. So, most of them. I know General Washington was in that battle. He didn't die. And as for being a vegan, he didn't do this all the time because I remember reading he went on a voyage, and on this voyage it was raining, and they caught a lot of cod, and he didn't want to eat it, but then he got some sort of idea that seemed to sanction this. So he went and he said, in his words, he said, "And that night I dined heartily on cod." So he wasn't always a vegan, but it sounded like he was quite a bit.
And how was he educated? Did he go to a public school, or what kind of school system did they have back then?
He went to a grammar school at 8, but he was pulled, I think, for helping in the business. His father was a tallow chandler, and so he had him help by cutting wick and boiling stuff.
So he went straight to work?
Yep. But I know he actually taught himself part of the way when he was at home too, so that's why he's mostly self-taught.
Mm-hmm.
But he did go to a couple schools.
Did it work out for him? Like, in the end, was he better off than when he started, or
I'm not sure what he thought.
did he die a beggar?
No, he did not die a beggar.
Somewhere?
He eventually set up his own printing house and became very rich. He was very wealthy, although he didn't buy all the nice china and things for a long time. It took a few years for him to start accumulating this stuff.
Yeah, I just saw a page here where he was in debt and he was being very frugal, it said.
Yeah.
And he was paying off his debt.
He had that.
Unlike today, when we're some people want other people to pay their debts, like school loans, you know.
Yeah. No, he paid that off eventually, and he became very rich. And he was very wealthy, which I think is a good thing. It proves he was working hard and wanted to make a good life for himself. So it seemed he always wanted to own a printing house, and he printed pamphlets and things.
So he was like a publisher? And
yes, he was, and he published a lot of things.
Would you recommend this book for people, for kids or adults, or?
I would recommend it for, I would say, at least 14.
Okay.
Because I couldn't see a 12-year-old and maybe not even a 13-year-old reading this. They'd probably stop at page 5.
But you read it.
Well, I read it, but I also like to learn things that most people don't, so that's why I read it.
Okay. Final words?
Well, he likes to learn
languages. Was he an inspiration, or?
He was inspiration. He's a very...
Should he have been a president?
I think he could have been one. I think he would have been a really great president, but I don't think he ever wanted to be a president.
He didn't want to be in the spotlight?
No, I don't think he wanted to be a spotlight guy.
Okay.
I also, there is one extra thing I'd like to add. He liked to learn languages, and at one point, when he was learning languages, he was learning one with a friend, but this friend constantly wanted to play chess. So he said, alright, well then, if you want to play chess, we'll play chess, but whoever wins has to decide what the other has to learn in the next week or so.
So what happened?
So they learned quickly because the chess was interfering with his studying of Italian, Latin. He wanted to learn a lot of languages.
Did he learn any?
Yep, but he learned Italian, I believe, and I think he learned Latin. Latin was a big one to learn back then. Everyone wanted to learn Latin.
Okay.
So I think it was a good book, and I don't think anyone could have put it better than Ben Franklin himself.
I'm glad he kept it small. You know, some people have a big autobiography that's really thick, but his is pretty small.
Yeah, it's small, although the words, if you look, are quite tiny. They're very small words.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it sounds like he was really great. I always do it, but it was great to learn a little more about him.
All right. Well, anything else? Did you cover it all?
I think
Are
I
you going to
covered
read
most
it
of it.
again later, a few years?
Yes, I probably will read it in the future so I can learn a little more, because there are a couple things I missed when he was talking off on his virtues or other things that's kind of hard to understand. He used very big words, a large vocabulary.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Tristan, for reading this book and telling us what you thought about it, and we'll see what you come up next with your next book.
Yeah, I look forward to it.